Okay, so welcome everyone. We're going to deal in this panel with a very provocative topic, as you can see by the title that has been given by the organization. I wanted to start by saying that competition intervention in digital markets is not really new. In the US in 1956, there was an important consent decree on IBM practices on the marketing of what it was then their A400 system. And in Europe in 1984, there was also a settlement at a time where there was no explicit settlement power in Regulation 17, also with IBM, dealing with the marketing of their system at the time, the A370. And that settlement included provisions on things like interoperability. What an odd question, right? Even in the landmark McGill judgment in 1991 of the Court of First Instance, at paragraph 50, there's an obiter dictum whereby the Commission says that the approach it had taken in that case as to copyright was also applicable to software. And so, again, issues of access to competitors' software was something that was dealt with at the time. And then we had the Microsoft cases in the US in the 1990s, and then new cases in the US and the EU in the early 2000s. So going over this old history, I'm reminded of a line in one of my favorite sci-fi TV series, the early 2000s reboot of Battlestar Galactica, where they said something like, "All this has happened before, all this will happen again." And this is, of course, taken from the prologue of one of the most beautiful and insightful books of the Bible, Ecclesiastes, book 1, verse 9. This idea that there's always this returning circle. And in 2015, even the conservative and respectable magazine, The Economist, published a series of articles comparing the new big tech billionaires to the late 19th century robber barons in the US. But the question is there really nothing new under the sun? In the 1990s, W. Brian Arthur wrote an influential article on the Harvard Business Review, arguing that the new digital economy was substantially different from what he called smokestack industries, and this was due, among other things, to increasing returns and network externalities. And indeed, following a number of important reports published in 2019, the Furman Report, the Kremer Report, the Stigler Report, and also an important report by the Portuguese Competition Authority, by the way, on digital ecosystems in 2019, the perception arose that not only are the developments in digital markets different from what occurred before, addressing perceived market failures actually required new approaches and even new rules. And in 2022, at breakneck speed for the EU legislator, we had the DMA. Now, I'm not going to discuss the nature of the DMA, but it's clearly a regulatory approach, even if it draws from a lot of the Commission's practice under Article 102. And I cannot resist quoting the beginning of Recital 5 of the DMA. It states, "It follows that the market processes are often incapable of ensuring fair economic outcomes with regard to core platform services." And this, I think, is a very, very strong and unheard of indictment by in this case, the EU legislator, as to the enforceability of Articles 101 and 102 in digital markets. And then it goes on to analyze the limitations of 101 and 102. But so, in view of this, here we are now. So in the EU, we now have this dual track with the DMA and Article 102, which will be covered later in the next panel. In the UK, we have now a regime that has been enacted for dealing with digital markets, albeit following a different perspective. Brazil is also now at the forefront of this debate with a new bill. I don't know if it is a big, beautiful bill, but at least it's a bill right now. It was submitted to Congress by President Lula. And on the other hand, you have the US, where Congress's infamous inability to form consensus means that there will be no DMA, but there's still the good old-fashioned antitrust, and we have a number of cases dealing with digital markets across the Atlantic that are really, really important. And so it's a pleasure to me to have such a distinguished panel to discuss this provocative title. So, given the current state of affairs, is there still hope for contestability in these markets, or are we somehow locked in to whatever this reality is? And so we're going to benefit from the fact that we have a tour d'horizon of the main jurisdictions. I'm going to start with Brazil, Camila, to let us know about CADE's approach to digital markets, and in particular, what can we expect from this new bill? So, Camila, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I first want to start by thanking the agency for the invitation. And coming to Portugal always feels like home, and especially connected and truly among family. You did a very amazing introduction, so I go straight to what the Brazil is doing right now. So in Brazil, the diagnosis you just said is already clear. We face the same global patterns of concentration and dependence, with a few large platforms acting as unavoidable gateways across multiple services. And we've seen concrete cases, the 30% fees in app stores, barriers to entry in payment services, and exclusivity clauses in marketplaces. This experience has strained the view that while competition law remains essential, it needs to be complemented by preventive framework, and one that can act before market power becomes entrenched, ensuring openness, and promotes competition as a process, not only as an outcome, and real contestability in digital market. So ex-post enforcement faces clear limits in Brazil as well. Investigations take years, standards of proof are high, and many behaviors like self-preference or exclusionary design are hard to detect or to prove. And when remedies do arrive, they often come too late to make a difference. So this was the Google shopping case, which took 7 years, for example, is a classic example of that. So it's based on this diagnosis that Brazil advances the discussion of a new ex-ante regulatory framework. The process started back in 2023 with a broad consultation by the Ministry of Finance, over 300 submissions from 72 stakeholders across 80 countries, and dialogue with authorities in academia and so on. So CADE played a central role throughout the initiative, was even recognized internationally, and this approach led to the bill, as you said, our new bill, number 4675, which is currently awaiting referral by the President of the Chamber of Deputies. So this proposal grants CADE new powers to designate systemically relevant digital platforms and to impose tailored obligations aimed at ensuring contestable, transparent, and more open digital markets. The institutional designs emerging from this debate propose the creation of the superintendents for digital market. I'm calling this SMD to make it simple, and within CADE. And it will have a 2-year, the superintendent will have a 2-year renewable mandate, and its role will be to initiate proceedings, propose obligations, and monitor compliance. And it will also cooperate with other regulators as mentioned before. Cooperation is mentioned in the bill. I think that it's important to just say the objects that there are in the bill, and the understanding that the objectives of the law are straightforward and mutually reinforcing. So the first one is reduce entry barriers, ensuring that new firms, startups, and smaller innovators can challenge incumbents on fair terms. The second one is to protect the competitive process itself, not only prices or isolated abuses, but the conditions for rivalry to exist. So you're saying transparency, interoperability, and so on. And the third one is promote freedom of choice for both consumers and businesses. The criteria for designations is clear. So global revenue, about 15 billion reais, which means around 9 billion euros, or global revenue, or 5 billion, around 1 billion euros in Brazil, plus the presence in outside markets, or it also consider qualitative criteria such as operating outside, network effects, engaging vertical integration or adjacent market activities, occupying a strategic position for third parties business development, having significant access to data and users, or offering multiple digital service. So the process starts within the SMD, lasts up to 10 years, and is subject to public hearing, final approval by CADE's tribunal. And special obligations are then defined through administrative proceedings, preventive, tailored, and sector-specific. And the obligations are organized through 3 pillars. So first, transparency requirements, the second, prohibitions, and the third, positive obligations. So together, these ensure that obligations are not abstract, they're actionable and concrete. And the example of prohibitions, there are only examples of prohibitions, include self-preference, exclusivity in marketplaces, restricting access to essential inputs, predatory strategy, and so on. And the positive, interoperability, data portability, giving access to performance metrics, allowing users to uninstall pre-installers, and so on. So, of course, none of this matters without effective enforcement. That's why the framework creates a supervision procedure with mandatory compliance reports, independent audits, like at companies' expense, and cooperation across authority, just Frederic mentioned. It even allows civil society to participate through complaints and contribution. And there are sanction mirror antitrust penalties as well. And when it comes to drafted bill, it's important to say, as we are in the international forum, the comparative choice made in its design are deliberate rather than imitative. It's about other jurisdictions' experience. So for the proposals of this discussion, it must be interesting to highlight 3 elements of the draft that are still being refined, of course, but already deserve our attention. So first, designation is enterprise-based rather than service-specific. This follows the logic of Section 19 of German's Act against restraint of competition, where the unity of analysis is the undertaking itself and treated as the organizing node of market power. And the second, obligations are bespoke, meaning they are tailored to the designated firm and to the specific bottlenecks it creates. So these obligations come together with a quantitative threshold that works as a floor of safe harbor. And this design choice is inspired by the United Kingdom Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act of 2024. But it's made explicitly in our draft text to ensure predictability and proportionality. And in conclusion, Brazil is moving toward a modern, balanced framework that aligns competition policy with the challenges of the 21st century, I guess. It strengthens enforcement, enhances digital sovereignty, protects consumers, and creates the condition for innovation and growth, as we hope. It's about keeping digital markets open, fair, dynamic, not only for today's players, but for the ones yet to come.
Thank you very much, Camila. It's quite interesting because last year we were at a conference together in Coimbra, and I told you, well, you guys should wait and see to learn from other experiences, and I think you come up with a really sort of learned system. You've picked up some of the things that you said that are familiar for those of us who know the MA, but you gave it a very interesting twist. Because first of all, you still have it in-house. And so this means that the separation that you have between investigation with the superintendent and then decision-making by CAGI, this is also going to apply in this case, right?
Yes, but in a separate unit.
But in within the superintendent's?
No,
okay. So it will be a different superintendent?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, so it'll have a different body under. Okay, that's quite interesting.
As it says in the bill.
Okay, and as for the designation, since you're going to designate business firms, do you think it's a more direct approach to ecosystems to deal with what Professor Jenny was saying, that you have competition between two different sets of services, and so it's preferable to focus on the business itself rather than on the lines of business? Is that something you've thought of?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we're going to now move to the UK, where you were part of this generation of thinking with the Furman report, of thinking about digital markets. You've had your own time maturing the system, and the system has kicked in, and we've just had designation decisions out there. Everyone was talking about it, saying, quite interesting. I read it on the train, someone told me. So let's hear from the United Kingdom.
Great. Thank you very much, Miguel, and thanks very much to the Portuguese Authority for having me here. Real privilege to be here in Lisbon, and actually I think very good to follow Camila in these first round of comments, because I think there are some very interesting common threads. So yes, I was just going to give a bit of an overview of what we're doing in the UK in terms of digital markets and how we're doing it. As you said, the digital markets competition regime in the UK is just about to hit its 10-month anniversary, having come into force on the 1st of January. And we have this concept as the sort of gateway to the framework of strategic market status, where we consider a certain firm for that status in a particular digital activity. So it differs from Brazil in that respect. If we designate a firm with that status, we can then introduce or consider introducing bespoke targeted measures to support growth, to support investment, to support innovation, and all of that, of course, through contestability, to the title of the panel. And so our investigations into Google in search and Google and Apple in mobile have been the first investigations under this new framework. The test for whether a firm has SMS, it's in our Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act from last year. We start with a revenue threshold, but that's just a sort of gating procedure so that we can't even consider smaller firms for SMS. But then the key parts of the test are whether the firm has substantial and entrenched market power and a position of strategic significance in respect of that digital activity. And so, as you said, we found earlier this month that Google has strategic market status in general search and search advertising. And just yesterday, we found that Apple and Google have SMS in their respective mobile platforms. And by mobile platforms, we mean operating systems, mobile browsers and browser engines, and app stores. I think important to note, a finding of SMS doesn't carry any presumption of wrongdoing. It doesn't impose any requirements automatically. Rather, following the SMS designation, we can then consider proportionate, targeted requirements that specifically address issues that we might have identified through the investigations. That's briefly the what. In terms of how we're doing it, we've been rolling out this new framework and bedding in our 4Ps framework through the digital markets competition regime, just as we have been across the CMA. You may have heard this before, but this is our 4Ps. Actually, you mentioned two of them, Camila, but they are pace, proportionality, predictability, and process. So on the pace side, we have a 9-month statutory deadline for an SMS investigation, and I've also been working on potential interventions alongside those designations, again, in the interest of pace. Proportionality is very much central to the legislation. I've mentioned already the sort of tight limits on designation scope. There's also no automatic process of designation. There are no blanket rules here. And we have to consider proportionality alongside effectiveness in setting any requirements. When we talk about process, we particularly are getting at our participative approach to this new framework. So I think you can sum that up as we're really trying to make it as easy as possible to come and talk to us on these topics. Just as an example, on mobile, I think we've spoken to more than 150 different organizations through the course of the investigations. We've been to see both Google and Apple in their headquarters in Silicon Valley, which I think can be really helpful in understanding the reality to the markets. And likewise, both companies have had good access to CMA decision makers directly. Then on predictability, also very important, the sort of flexibility of the regime that is so beneficial could potentially leave some scope for uncertainty. So we're really working hard to make our work as predictable as possible. So as I said, alongside the designation process, we've been thinking about what potential actions we might take. And now those designations are in place, you'll expect to see us start to consult on specific measures. And those could be to strengthen competition, deliver better outcomes, more choice and control for consumers, lower costs for businesses. And this isn't a requirement in the legislation, but alongside the provisional SMS decisions in the summer, we published 3 roadmaps showing how we would likely prioritize any actions, particularly during the first half of the 5-year designation period, to help with certainty, to help with predictability, both for SMS firms and for others. And just briefly, we took a phased approach in those roadmaps and broke down the potential sets of actions into categories. The first category was category 1, includes early priorities, which we would expect to deliver the quickest benefits for UK consumers and businesses, particularly focusing on greater choice and control. Category 2 then are, broadly speaking, more complex issues, where again we think there may well be a case for action, but which require longer consideration. And we also, importantly, this I think goes to Professor Jenny's challenge, we flagged some particular areas in there where we would want to track what's happening elsewhere in the world and keep under review what that means for the UK. So just briefly on the search roadmap, this covered, broadly speaking, 2 big objectives. One, to make sure that consumers and businesses are treated fairly and have confidence in the way they interact with Google in search. And 2, to promote competition and innovation through targeted steps, such as ensuring that all firms, including Google, can compete and innovate in new AI-based search interfaces. So early priorities include choice screens, fair ranking principles to ensure better confidence for content providers, data portability, and publisher controls to make sure that transparency, attribution, and choice for publishers in how their content, which is collected for search, is then used or maybe used in Google's AI services. In mobile, we've got separate roadmaps for Apple and Google. Those roadmaps are quite different from one another, and that reflects, of course, the very significant differences between the business models of these 2 companies. There are some common themes, for example, fair and transparent app review and rankings processes, but there are some really important differences, such as for Apple, an important focus on interoperability so that developers can have access to the functionality they need to be able to compete. And we are paying very close attention to what's going on elsewhere in the world, Europe, US, Japan, Brazil, litigation, regulation, enforcement, clearly a lot going on. And to Professor Jenny's challenge, I mean, if it helps, we've been asking ourselves exactly the same questions that he was asking, which is, will a remedy elsewhere in the world imposed on one of these firms effectively address the issue in the UK? I think there is a lot still to play through on that, of course, and it partly depends on the nature of that remedy, but also how the firm in question responds to the remedy, and whether, for example, they roll out a change globally or geofence that to a specific jurisdiction. But in the end, the goal is always to deliver the best possible outcomes for the UK in the most proportionate and pragmatic way possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Will. And now we move on to the Commission with João Varela. João, you're in an ungrateful position because you're at DG right? And so you have the two-ring circus going on because you have 102 and then you have the DMA to deal with these digital markets. So tell us something then about the EU experience and these early times of the DMA. Well, not that early by now, but tell us about your experience there.
Thank you, Miguel, and boa tarde a todos. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a place that was my home for 6 years. I'm very happy to be back to the Portuguese Competition Authority for this conference. And I'm also very happy to be talking about one of the key priorities of the European Commission, which is basically to keep a fair, competitive, and innovative digital markets in Europe. And within the European Commission, DG Comp, it has a very important role in that, to get enrolled in that mission. We can use many tools in our work. So we have mergers, we have stated, but we also have then antitrust and the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. And here I will focus on the last two, so on the Digital Markets Act and the antitrust, and what we have been doing the last 2 years using these two instruments to try to deal with some issues that we find in the digital markets. And I will start with the antitrust. So in recent years, and specifically in the recent months, the Commission has been very active in addressing the competition concerns in digital markets. Our interventions have drawn in a wide range of tiers of harm, also different decision types and different remedies. And this reflects both the complexity of the digital ecosystems and also the commitment to ensure that the competition rules evolve when the markets evolve. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the most recent decisions regarding tying. So this is a traditional concept, it's nothing very new. We've been applying tying in many other sectors. And this is something that we also observe a lot happening in digital markets. So recently we adopted 2 decisions regarding tying digital markets. So one is the Facebook Marketplace case, where the Commission found basically that Meta was tying its marketplace service to its dominant social network. And with this, it was gaining a competitive advantage, distribution advantage vis-à-vis its competitors. Similarly, we have a recent decision against Microsoft, which regarding Microsoft Teams, where we found that Microsoft was tying its communication tool Teams to its Office suite, and this was also preliminarily shown to be capable of producing exclusionary effects. Then we also have some more recent use of harm, where we applied an Article 12A, which it's not a recent use of harm, but it's not been applied for some time, which regards unfair trading conditions. And we have adopted recently 2 decisions also on this topic. So the first one was the Apple Music streaming case, where we found that Apple was banning app developers from informing the iOS users about cheaper subscription that they could find outside the App Store, and also was preventing those users, those app developers from telling to users how they could find these alternatives. On Facebook Marketplace, there was a second area of the investigation, which regarding also unfair trading conditions, where we found that Meta was imposing on advertisers competing with its product marketplace conditions that were unfair, because basically Meta was forcing these advertisers to allow the use of their data for the improvement of Meta's own product that will compete then against these advertisers. So it could be seen something as unfair and that they would try to basically avoid, but Meta always said that this was part of their conditions and there was no possibility to change. A third one, which is something that is really more novel, and it started with Google Shopping, which is a self-referencing theories of harm. And recently we applied in our Google AdTech decision. In this case, we found Google's practices within its advertising technology will correspond to favoring. And here we have something that we find very often in this type of digital market, which was when these gatekeepers have a dual role. So in many cases, they are the referee and the player of the same game, and this creates what we call the conflicts of interest. Because how can you dictate the rules of the game where you're also participating and competing with others? And in this particular case, we find that Google was adopting many self-referencing practices because of this conflict of interest, because of this temptation to always adapt the rules to its own player in the game. All these decisions, they illustrate also our flexibility. So in some of the cases, like the case of Apple, Meta, and Google, the Commission adopted prohibition decisions, which impose fines and also remedies. But we also adopt some commitment decisions, as the case of Microsoft, where basically the company offered voluntarily some solutions to address the concerns, and we accepted the solutions would address our preliminary concerns, and therefore we adopted an Article 9 decision where basically accepted commitments. I wanted also to talk a bit about remedies, and because I think the tendency in the last years that we're trying to be more prescriptive in the remedies in our decisions. Before we had a lot of cease and desist, which gives a lot of space to the companies, and sometimes we see that the situations are not totally solved after our decisions, and we try not to be a bit more prescriptive when we have the decisions and try to guide the companies in what we expect them to do to comply with our decisions. And so in the Facebook Marketplace case, we order Meta to either offer a marketplace as a standalone product or to basically create a choice screen inside Facebook for users to be able to choose what providers they want to make available. And on the Google Ad Tech case, also because of what I referred before, the conflicts of interest, we are basically considering ordering the structural remedies to address precisely those conflicts of interest, because behavioral remedies may not work when companies can just adopt other practices that produce the same effects, because the conflicts of interest are still there, and despite any cease and desist that can happen. So all these decisions, the aim was to increase the contestability of digital services, and they send a clear signal to the market about the types of practices that the Commission considers anti-competitive. However, although this antitrust enforcement is robust and has been instrumental in shaping many of the digital markets during the last quarter century, some of the examples you start with Microsoft and also then Android shopping and these most recent ones, it also revealed to us that there are some limitations. And so export enforcement, by its nature, sometimes cannot address the systemic issues, the issues that we see that happen in the whole market and not just with a particular company. And this is precisely why we created the Digital Markets Act, so to try to address these systemic problems. And in that sense, seeing the need to be more proactive and reacting to these systemic issues, the DMA was adopted in 2022 as an ex-ante regulation, which has two main objectives, which is to ensure that markets remain fair and contestable. Many of the obligations that are included in the DMA, they basically took some learnings from the past antitrust decisions, Google Android, Google Shopping, Amazon Buy-Box, but also some of the ones that are referred that were already ongoing when the DMA was being adopted. Now I want to talk a bit about what we have done with the DMA in the last 2 years. So we've been quite active in the Commission. We have designated 7 gatekeepers, so Amazon, Apple, Booking, ByteDance, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. We have reviewed their compliance plans. We have engaged extensively with those gatekeepers and also with the stakeholders. We have concluded the first wave of enforcement proceedings, which included both specification decisions but also non-compliance decisions. And I would like here to mention that although in the media what you see is mostly of our enforcement proceedings, which are more controversial, more disputable with the companies, I think a lot have been already achieved with any disputes, with just by companies complying to the obligations that were there, and that basically they have changes their business practices with not contesting, not appealing to our decision. In these cases, we have, for instance, users now of third-party messaging services. They can talk with their friends on Facebook, on Messenger, and then on WhatsApp without having an account with these services. Google no longer requires the users to sign up to Gmail in order to have access to its apps like Android, YouTube, Google Play. Users can also choose which browser and which search engine they can have on their mobile devices via the choice screens that are implemented. Individuals now have better control of what gatekeepers do of their data, what they can be combined, what can be used for advertising. Business also have better use of and control of their data that is shared in the relationship between their own business and their customers that using the gatekeepers platform. And for instance, travel agencies now, travel service providers can now offer freely their products at different prices in their own platforms, in third-party platforms, compared with Booking.com, for instance. So all these are tangible changes that have improved market contestability, and they have been achieved with any of these adversarial procedures that we also often like to debate and make that news in the paper. But still, there are many issues that are not solved this way, and the DMA includes the comprehensive toolbox that allows to address these other issues which are more contentious. One of the tools is the specification procedure. This is some new proceeding that doesn't exist in antitrust. And basically, it's something that is not based on wrongdoing or in sanctions. It's just a decision where the Commission guides the gatekeeper on how to comply with an obligation and provides some legal certainty to this gatekeeper on how they should behave in a market. And in this case, we adopted recently in March 2 decisions addressed to Apple, where basically we told Apple how to improve interoperability between its operating system and third-party devices. And then there are the non-compliance procedures, the ones that are more really adversarial, that involve market investigations, preliminary findings, rights of defense, cease and desist order, and ultimately also fines. And in this case, we had 6 non-compliance investigations. 2 have already been decided, one against Apple steering provisions in the App Store, and one against Meta on this consent pay model for advertising. One investigation has been closed by the Commission because Apple introduced significant changes in its choice screens and defaults that allow us to close this investigation. And 3 are ongoing, 2 regarding Google, so on anti-steering rules and on its self-referencing and the Google search, and 1 regarding Apple's business model for app distribution. And I would like to conclude here that this is not the end. I think now we are looking to the next milestone with the DMA. So in May 26, the Commission will basically conduct its first formal review of the DMA as mandated by the regulation. And this is a key moment to reflect what we have achieved so far with the DMA and what can still be achieved, what can we improve. So we are collecting qualitative and quantitative evidence to assess how the DMA can be improved. But let's also be realistic. The DMA is not here to address every issue, every practice. Some of the practices, for instance, the ones I mentioned before, they were related with services which are not designated by the DMA, like the Microsoft Office suite. And others are not included in the DMA, like self-referencing within advertising services. So I think there's still a lot of space, and DigiComp is, in that sense, in a good position to make use of both tools, the antitrust and the DMA, in a complementary way. I think antitrust will allow us to tackle anti-competitive conduct case by case, and the DMA will continue allowing us to address broader, more systemic market concerns in a forward-looking manner. And together, they form a very coherent and powerful framework, one that we hope ensures that Europe's digital economy remains open, fair, and contestable. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting because there's this sort of debate between ex-ante regulation, ex-post antitrust, which is not entirely true because there's also some sort of ex-ante antitrust to some extent, and some regulation is also ex-post, but whatever. But there's this idea that I got from this very old musical movie called My Fair Lady, where Professor Higgins is exasperated and asks, why can't women be more like men? And so why can't competition authorities be more like regulators, one might ask, and regulators might ask the other way around. And so from what I've heard from you, it seems that the outcome focus of the DMA, focus on fairness and contestability in markets, also seems to be infused now into your antitrust cases, because if you're prescribing remedies, that's sort of more what you expect from regulation. And also, the way you're guiding firms in compliance reminds me of something that Luis mentioned in his keynote speech here 2 years ago about the difference between referees in soccer and referees in rugby, and how one guides the game and the other says, okay, stop what you're doing. And so I'll hand it to you, Luis. What can you tell us about the US and also your overview of these different perspectives?
Thank you. I'll get to rugby in a second. First of all, just for the record, I don't work for any agency in the US. In fact, I don't have a real job. I'm just an academic. That means that I'm looking at all of this from a certain distance, which can be a disadvantage in many ways, but can also be an advantage. So just bear with me. I am not familiar with a lot of the details from the DMA, from DMU, and from the Brazilian experience either. But I'll just try to make 2 or 3 fairly general points about the digital space. First off, you quoted Brian Arthur early on, and it kind of brought some memories to me, because I suffered through Brian Arthur's classes back in 85, 86.
And this book is very boring.
Not my words. Anyway, I did suffer, and I still remember he insisting, the digital economy is different from the traditional economy. He was right. He was not right about the fact that no one was listening to him. People were actually listening to him. He was right about the fact that the digital economy is different, and I think it makes sense for this panel to be specifically on digital markets. He was wrong, in my opinion, about the reason why they are different. So he kept insisting about network effects, scale economies, things like that. Listen, I mean, scale economies, we've known that for 200 years, maybe, or something like that. So the two characteristics that, in my opinion, made this panel a distinct panel that make digital markets different is not so much scale economies, which we find in steel as well, but rather extremely fast changing business models. In fact, they change at a rhythm that's way faster than the rhythm of enacting and applying regulation. So that's the first one. And second one, which is also important, is extremely difficult to enforce property rights, compared, for example, with pharma or something like that. And I think it's helpful to keep this in mind because competition policy has to adapt itself to the different needs of different sectors. That's one. And the relative balance between different instruments, in particular antitrust, regulation, and so forth, in my opinion, does depend on the particular characteristics of each industry, in particular now at digital markets. So I don't know if you remember before the pandemic, I know that time kind of warps around the pandemic, but before then, at least in the US, the big discussion on digital markets and big tech was not about regulation. In fact, that word was hardly ever brought to discussion. It was all about mergers and acquisitions. Why? Because the 5 large platforms formerly known as GAFAM by then had acquired more than 800 companies since 2000, none of which were blocked by any of the antitrust agencies in the United States or in Europe or in the UK. And because they were gaining so much power, understandably, there was a clamor for moving towards a stricter merger policy. And so there are people like politicians like Elizabeth Warren calling for a total ban on acquisitions by large platforms. There were economists like Fiona Scott-Morton calling for a reversal of the burden of proof in mergers in the US, which in the US context, by the way, essentially amounts to a complete ban on mergers. So that was a discussion. The word regulation was not used. And at the time, I became a little bit of a minority, a little bit of a minority, let's put it that way, because I was making the point, careful, because you may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Many of these 800 acquisitions were extraordinary in terms of increasing value. I mean, where would Fingerworks be without Apple? You probably never heard of Fingerworks. So Fingerworks is the firm that created the technology of an operating system that you use with your finger on a screen. Were it not for Fingerworks, we might still be with BlackBerries pressing keyboards in our hands and whatnot. But of course, on their own, they had, their annual revenue was something like $1 million a year. $1 million a year. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of value to be created by combining technologies and so forth. And so that's what I was trying to make that point. And since then, and I still think it was a good point. And since then, a lot of things happened that moved us away from that discussion on mergers in the digital markets and more towards regulation. There's, DMU was created, the DMA was enacted, the Draghi report was published, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, that was a very positive step because I think in the portfolio of instruments we have to regulate markets, some industries, merger policy is relatively more important, some industries, regulation is relatively more important. I believe this is one where the marginal value of regulation is relatively higher than the marginal value of merger policy, as people were trying to push for 5, 6 years ago. Now, so far so good. But as Yogi Berra would say, in theory, theory and practice are the same thing. In practice, it's not. And so it all depends on how you actually do things. And the discussion, we already heard that today here several times, there's ex-ante regulation, there's exposed regulation. So my theory, and this comes to what Miguel was mentioning earlier, is that I have this theory that in digital markets, considering the specific characteristics that they have, the right form of going about regulation is not ex-ante regulation, it's not ex-post regulation, and I'm not sure what the Latin name would be, is in-the-middle regulation. I checked online, I believe it would be in acto regulation. I studied Latin in school, but it was 150 years ago. So perhaps I should explain what I mean by in acto regulation. In order to do that, I'm going to go back to this analogy that I made right here 2 years ago, and I apologize for those who are going to have to hear that again. The analogy between sports and regulation, between refereeing and being a regulator, and in particular within, so sports, soccer, football, for us Europeans, and rugby, they both have regulations. There's ex-ante regulation, of course, which is the rules of the game. You know, they're published, the teams know the rules, everybody knows that. There is ex-post regulation in both cases. Ex-post regulation is the referee stops the game, that's a foul, he dishes out a yellow card or a red card or whatever, punishments, that's ex-post regulation. The big difference between football and rugby, for those of you who are not familiar with rugby, in my opinion, it's the most beautiful game in the world. People say it's football, but it's not, it's rugby. Anyway, the distinctive feature of rugby union in particular, in the past 20, 30 years, is the way the referee proceeds. First of all, referees are mic'd, as I am right now, and they're mic'd for the entire stadium, so everyone listens to what they're talking. And they are talking all the time, during the entire game. Why? You need to know a little bit about rugby, and I don't have a lot of time, but I'll be very brief in here. So, for example, the offside rule in a ruck is very complicated in rugby. So in football, there's an imaginary line beyond which you cannot pass. In rugby, it's way more complicated, and not even now, right here, can explain to you, but you can only get inside the ruck, which is, basically it's a group of players piling up on the top of each other. You can only get there from a certain manner. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is one occasion in which what the referee does is if he sees that a player is doing it wrong, the referee will say, don't go there, don't go there. So the referee is not punishing the player. He's not calling a foul. He's telling him, listen, I'm giving you a chance. Get out of there, and the game will continue on. If you don't listen to me, you'll see what happens. For example, if a player has a ball, is holding the ball in a ruck, and is taking a long time to get rid of it, use it. We hear it all the time. Use it, which means, you already had it for several seconds. It's time for you to get rid of it. So instead of having like a clock and marking the time and see, has he held the ball for more than so many seconds? No, let's just work it out between us. Or if a player is laying down on the wrong side of the line, roll out, get out of there. There are many, many examples. If you watch a game of rugby, you'll see the referee talking constantly. And that's what I mean by in acto regulation. It is somewhere between ex-ante and ex-post regulation. It's about interpreting regulation. And if you do that, then what you can have, what in my opinion will be the ideal system of regulation, which is one where ex-ante regulation is only a very small set of basic general principles that you then try to apply in this particular case. Why is that important in digital markets? Because, no offense to the European Commission, the DMA, the moment it was approved, it was out of date. And in fact, here's an interesting exercise. Think about the future in the next few years. What's the future? AI agents, they'll start, personalized AI agents will appear in just a matter of a few months or a few weeks. That will completely change the nature of competition. All of the behavioral biases that people have been talking about, choosing the top of the list or the rounding number is 99 cents or whatever, that's going to be disappearing in just a matter of a few months because, of course, personalized agents are not subjected to human behavioral biases. It's going to be a completely different game. There will be other regulatory problems. So think about that world, the battle of the bots, as I like to call it, which will take place in the next few years, and think, how does the DMA apply to that? I don't even know where to begin because the problems are very different. The basic principles of a level play field are the same, but I think the specifics of how it applies will be very different. So that's the reason why I really like rugby refereeing. I have more things to say, but I'll stop here. And apologies for taking so long.
Thank you, Luis, for incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. Let me go back now on the reverse order this time and ask, what do you think about this concept of in acto regulation? Because what you were talking about, João, seems to indicate that at least the small measure, there are some instruments that allow the Commission to sort of do something that is similar and help firms, guide firms as to how to comply. So how do you see this in acto regulation within the DMA now? Not in traditional enforcement, that's a different game.
No, I understand what you're saying, and it's true that the DMA, like every European legislation, takes time to be adopted, and many times the markets are now moving more faster and faster, and with AI we see things changing. I think with these specification decisions, for instance, what we do is to, instead of having an adversarial against the companies, we kind of try to guide the companies about, we see what they are doing, we have the word of the DMA, and we try to somehow guide them on how to best adjust their business in order to comply with that obligation of the DMA. Now, of course, we are still talking about an obligation. It was set in 2022. There are ways where we can still look to these new products, parts of products that are designated in the DMA. Many of the times, search engines, AI is inside search engines, AI is inside the voice assistants. I don't know if what you're talking about could even be seen as potential as a voice assistant, and the voice assistant is part of the DMA, and there are obligations that could be applied in that case. So the DMA still has a bit of that space, and as I mentioned, we are also now at the time of revising it and seeing how it can be updated to adjust to the new products, to the new strategies that we are seeing companies adopting. But as usual, in many of these cases, like with legislation, it takes time, and there is also always that risk that you mentioned that we may be getting a bit late when when the markets are moving so fast. And that's why I think antitrust is a good complement there, because antitrust gives us a general approach. It's not obligations that are predetermined. It gives us a framework that we can apply and try to address the issues when we see them happen, and try to guide the companies with our decisions to say that we will address this. This is an issue that we see, like self-referencing, an issue that we see, and we don't see it only for search, we will see it also for other products, and we will be ready to act if we see something happening with the new products, with the new technologies, that is a similar effect. Now, I know you'll tell me antitrust takes time, and true, but I think we are trying also to improve that, and I think AI is not only bad, but also can help us with the tools that provide us. And I think now we are able to digest many more documents than before. I think now we have tools that allow us to digest 2-3 million documents quicker than before, and then hopefully this will also improve and make the process more efficient.
Thank you, João. And coming to one point you mentioned earlier, it's also important to say, because in antitrust we tend to look at, what have they decided, what have they prohibited, and we often forget all the little successes, sometimes big successes, just from things going on and firms complying. So that was a really great point you had made earlier.
Maybe one point that I can also add, and it's something that the Commission has done recently, not necessarily for the digital, but we are also starting to issue guiding letters, where basically companies are doing something and they ask us, is it what I'm doing correct? And somehow we can say, maybe that's a type, or say, okay, looking at it without doing an extremely advanced assessment, we can give you some confidence that looks right or that looks to go in the wrong direction. Maybe that's something that we may start using more. We have the first ones issued very recent, and that's something that the Commission now is probably can start doing more and more often.
So I like that. I just think that the DMA could be 1/10 of the length, that's all.
Okay. Will, you have a big responsibility because rugby comes from the United Kingdom, so...
Thank you.
What's your comment on Luis's insight?
My comment on Luis's insight is that rugby is indeed a beautiful game, even if I was terrible at playing it. And very interesting remarks on the in-flight regulation. I mean, actually, I think it's a little bit... It's a way of characterizing, I think, a bit of what we are attempting to do. We're not at the same point as the DMA yet, because we haven't yet imposed any obligations, of course. But I mean, your point about AI agents, I mean, that partly that really underlines the importance of excellent horizon scanning work and trying to keep up to speed with what's going on. But I think it probably also underlines the value of flexibility. So, this is something where this is sort of fundamental to the way that the DMCC Act was put through. So, there is no list of services that we have to look at under the DMCC Act. Instead, we have this broad concept of a digital activity, provision of a service via the internet or provision of digital content. And other than that distinction between digital and analog, it is technology neutral, as in there is no mention of AI in the Act, but then again, there's also no mention of search or mobile or browsers or any other specific technology one might name. Now that could sound quite open-ended, but that's of course where the high hurdles for the designation process come in. But importantly, all the concepts in there are economic concepts rather than being attached to a specific technology, and so I think are able to adapt to the kinds of developments you describe. And then what we've been trying to do as we do the designation work is get to grapple in quite detailed ways with what that means in practice as we define what that digital activity is. So for example, on the search investigation, we have defined, in Google's case, AI overviews and AI mode as being part of general search. But then we looked long and hard at Google's Gemini AI assistant and whether that should be included in the scope or not. Gemini uses Google Search as one of a number of inputs in response to a user query, and sometimes, in some cases, it may be being used by some users in a way that is a bit akin to search. But there's a mixed picture in terms of the evidence. AI assistant sector is still pretty nascent, quite dynamic. So we decided on the current position that the Gemini AI assistant should be out of scope, but with the possibility that it could, at least the search uses of it, could come into scope in future, again, based on how it's supplied and used. But again, to try and help with the predictability, we said that would only ever be subject to a further public consultation. So again, I think as we work with these dynamic markets and handle the kind of developments you highlight, I think trying to build in flexibility both in the framework and in the way that we interpret it, I think is important.
Okay, thank you. And Camilla, so you've talked about these bespoke type of obligations with a specialized team enforcing it. Do you think that you're also going to go into this more sort of following up on what firms, if they are complying and providing guidance? Is that something that you see happening in the context of the future Brazilian system? Or will it be, because it is an administrative procedure, right? So you can expect some degree of a cooperative or responsive regulation in a sense.
Yes. I think this is the spirit, and institutionally, Brazil is also advancing to complementary tracks. So we are still in the bill stage. So the first is the bill 2338, which creates the national system for AI regulation, and governance is called SIA. So it brings together central authorities, sectoral regulators, and CADE, with focus on coordination, harmonization, and cooperation. So internationally, they use IACT points in similar direction, emphasizing reporting, joint investigations, and access to data. And in developing country, of course, the emphasis often falls on open standards and repeatable compliance models so that countries can build capacity without excessive dependence. And within this architecture, CADE plays a key role, especially on competition risks and strategic dependencies. And the second complementary is the competition ex ante regulation bill, as I mentioned, because even though it's not AI specific, I believe that it's highly relevant to AI, but I think that CADE's ex ante instruments can be applied to conducts mediated by algorithms, also like ranking, discriminatory default designs, or restricted access to essential inputs like app stores and APIs and our user data. So in the sense, I believe in the future, so it's very predictive here, the two discussions will be closely connected. One, addresses how AI should be governed, and the other how market power built through AI should be disciplined.
Okay, because Brazil is one of the countries that is really more advanced in thinking about AI, how to implement it. You have a really well-developed strategy for applying it throughout government, and so you're really ahead. And so you have all these coordination structures that ensure that CAGI will play a role in the development of future regulation on AI. Is that right then?
Yeah, I think that the sovereign thing,
sovereign cloud and
lands also matters pretty much. So encouraging multi-cloud strategies, data portability, and scroll interface can reduce dependence on single providers, and public procurement as well can diversify the technological base and supporting local AI developers. So this is, I think it's the main efforts that we go into through the next years.
That's quite interesting, because so you're part of the political framework of the Brazilian government, and you're playing a supportive role, an advocacy role, also in promoting competition in this context, right? Yeah. Okay, that's great. And we had this problem with the service of AWS this week, I think, which underlined the vulnerabilities that we all have vis-à-vis these global providers. So that's an illustration of why some form of redundancy might be necessary now from an industrial policy perspective, which we've discussed very thoroughly this morning and in the earlier panel, in the earlier fireside chat. Will, you guys in the UK, in the CMA, you've really been going big on AI, looking through the value chain, identifying issues, also using your merger control powers. What can you tell us as to how you view AI now, this specific type of market, which is still evolving? I mean, I agree with Luis. I think agentic AI is going to change. It's going to be a game changer. But we still don't know exactly how they're going to make money, which, for me, if I identify a market, you have structure, conduct, performance. If you don't really have a strategy for monetization, I find it hard to think about it if there's no clear outcome from the process. So how do you view the AI, and how are you acting and preparing for these new market developments in the UK?
Yeah, so I think it's obviously always really important to be precise about what we're talking about when we say AI. So, I mean, like our Portuguese colleagues, we did this initial review of foundation models in particular, that's now a couple of years ago, sort of quite early on in the big Gen AI wave. And we talked through the value chain, and we talked about the input layer and the model development layer and the model release and then model deployment, and also how consumers then experience that, because we also cover the consumer protection mandate. And that was really important to sort of understand the landscape, and we offered some principles to try and suggest how these markets might move in more positive directions, or to sort of flag some of the risks that might exist. But I think actually you say we're going big on AI, we're actually doing a lot of work in terms of how we use AI internally ourselves, as every organization, I suppose. So there's that side of work going on. But in terms of how AI is being used in markets, I mean, actually, in the 3 SMS investigations that we've just completed, we've really been talking about AI and the deployment layer, and again, being quite precise about what we mean there. So I talked about the Gemini example on search. AI clearly is very important in the mobile market as well. I think there it particularly came in the 5-year forward look that we have to do as part of the SMS assessment. I'm happy to say we don't have to predict the future with full certainty for 5 years as part of the test, but we at least have to work out if there are expected or foreseeable developments that would eliminate the position of market power that we identify, to consider that test of whether it's entrenched or not. And there, so clearly we see lots of developments and lots of noise and action and investment in terms of AI-enabled browsers, or browsers that are trying to connect back to that AI agent offer, which, again, paying close attention to, but in the case of those mobile designations, took the view that those didn't pass that test of eliminating the market power over the 5-year period. Of course, again, back to flexibility. If we're wrong about that, we do have the scope to de-designate within the 5-year period. It's not a fixed feature for that full 5 years.
Okay. It's incredible because some 20 years ago, there was this project where since we have our computers shut down during the night, there was this, I think it was a NASA program where you could donate time on your processor through the internet so that they could make these very, demanding calculations by using your CPU at night. And right now, you're using fantastic amounts of computing power just to find out the best recipe for beef Wellington or some other triviality, but, well, humanity, right? So, João, you have virtual assistants in the DMA. You have search engines in the DMA. Is the DMA future-proofed for AI on this deployment stage? Or do you envisage that's something that will have to be thought out in the review that you're going to do in 2026?
Well, thank you for the question. And again, because we have the two instruments, I'll start maybe what we are been doing recently with the antitrust and then how the DMA can address some of these issues, because I think it's important to always look to the two tools that we have. So I think in September 24, the Commission published its policy brief on AI markets, and the findings were very much aligned with the report that was published by the Portuguese Competition Authority and also by the CMA. I think we're all looking to this market, I think, with the same eyes, and we're getting the same conclusions. And what we are finding is that basically AI services may have produced or are producing positive changes, but they also pose some potential competition concerns. And why? It's because AI depends on some key inputs. We're talking about large-scale capital, data, computing power, talent. And these inputs, very often, they are in the hands of a small number of large players, and which can make it difficult for new entrants to compete in this market. And in the same report, we also identify potential strategies that incumbent firms can adopt to reinforce their dominance from one market to the AI market using their portfolio, their ecosystem of products. And the things we discuss in this report are, for instance, that incumbent firms can grant access to these key inputs on exclusive basis, or they can even restrict the access totally and keep it for themselves. These incumbents can also use their market power in downstream markets. I'm talking here about the mobile operating systems or some user-facing services to limit the distribution of AI that is developed by rivals. This could be in the form of exclusive clauses, in the form of self-preferencing, tying, bundling. So many of the things we saw in the old digital market can also be replicated in the new, and we are starting to see some of those things happening also with AI. We also need to be looking to these agreements between horizontal competitors that can weaken competition. We've seen in the past that eventually when there is a big company having an agreement with a maverick, there can be a risk of reducing competition, or there can be the risk of exchange of sensitive information that can change the structure of the market. And finally, also, it's very important to see what's happening with potential acquisitions, if they constitute killer acquisitions, or even acqui-hires, where companies basically acquire a lot of the assets, the talents of a company, and how much these acquisitions can eventually eliminate potential rivals and basically defeat eventual innovations in the market. So we have been quite active on that, monitoring some of these practices, and we're also carefully scrutinizing mergers to take into account all these elements. So this is from the point of view of the antitrust and merger side. Now, regarding regulation, I think one thing it's important to look is that AI may require some ex-ante regulation, but similar to the DMA, I think it's important to understand first why you regulate the market, why are we regulating? And as I said, regulation is justified when we have some systemic problems that can effectively be addressed, that cannot be effectively be addressed by ex-post enforcement. And I think the issue is in AI, we now have a lot of good questions. I think we are learning this market, and we see every week is changing, there's a new problem appearing. But we don't have all the answers. I think we're still missing some of the answers. And I think in that sense, it's important that the authorities around the globe continue to monitoring very closely this sector, gathering influence, analyzing all the market dynamics, but very closely and fast, not just waiting to see how things happen. So we should remain vigilant, but at the same time, we should take into account that if we move too early in the regulation, there is a risk that we get it wrong, and we end up stifling innovation rather than promote it. So we need to have enough information, we need to follow it very closely, we need to be able to act quick, but we need to act also informally. This is not meaning that there should not be no regulation of AI systems. I think probably there will be some solid regulation, but first we need to also have the knowledge of what we are doing and the consequences of what we are doing. Now turning to the Digital Markets Act, as you asked, I think the DMA, as well, Luis mentioned, is not in the list of core platform services. So when the DMA was designed, and it was before 22, this was when it was adopted. This is a long process, and there was no AI, nobody was talking about this, so it's not in the list of Article 2.2 of the DMA. So it's not currently possible to designate an AI system per se as a service in the DMA. However, we see many of the AI functionalities integrating the core platform services. So we see AI functionalities in search, we see these AI functionalities in advertising, in social networks, in app stores. So there is a possibility to already regulate those using the DMA when basically they are implemented, integrated in those services, and they somehow go against the do's and don'ts of the DMA. I can give here an example. If a search engine is using AI to give an answer to a query, this AI system cannot favor one product of the gatekeeper vis-à-vis the others. So if they still self-preferencing, we can still regulate, because this is basically producing a self-preferencing result inside a search engine. And it's also when we start looking to virtual assistants, AIs will be powering most of these virtual assistants. So because we can apply DMA to virtual assistants, we could also apply the DMA in those cases. Now, the DMA is not here to prevent companies from innovating, and so it's here to prevent companies from using their power to create some entrenched positions and exclude rivals. And in the context of AI, it's very important that we avoid this, that we prevent these companies from doing this, taking actions that entrench their dominance. And so we will be looking to these AI ecosystems, and we are looking to ways to make it to continue to make it open and prevent gatekeepers to expand their dominant positions into AI emerging markets. And in that context, I think it's important for all the authorities to closely monitoring, not just the Commission, because these practices are global practices. I think it's important everyone in Europe, in the globe, that looks to these products, and I think more and more authorities are looking to AI. And we should be able, only that way we can early detect any potential anti-competitive conduct and try to avoid market steeping. And because of this, I think it's very important that we all talk in these forums like ECN, ICN, OECD. There was a discussion already this morning about the importance of these forums. I think it's very important that we all exchange what we are learning, our ideas, our suggestions of how to deal with the issues that we are facing, and try to have a coherent approach to AI practices and to the AI markets. So to conclude, I think we need to have this evidence-based, proportional, and forward-looking approach. We need to continue to be vigilant in the enforcement and regulatory prudence. And it's very good that we all try to be aligned and we all try to talk in different forums and in different conferences to allow us to make and move fast.
Yes, thank you, Jean. So that's a great point. It really dovetails into what Professor Genie was saying earlier, of the need to take a look at these things, think about, who's better placed to deal with these issues, and at least please try to develop some common sense as to how to go about these things. Ultimately, each jurisdiction is a jurisdiction, so they have each has its own powers, but that there's this need for coordination. I think it's a really great point. Luis, to come back to you, you mentioned earlier that in the US, people used to think about digital markets before the pandemic, mostly on merger control. Now looking at AI, is merger control the tool? Can it play it? Because we see all these deals, these cross deals between all these big tech firms. Some people talk about a bubble because there's money sort of circulating from one pocket to the other. Is merger control something that can be useful in ensuring that we will keep AI markets competitive? Or is it the traditional antitrust, wait and see until something happens? Because this is as you mentioned, AI agents are going to revolutionize how we interact, how we search. And the problem is, some specialists say that one of the problems that explains why AI has not had a sort of an extraordinary adoption by firms, it has fairly low rates of adoption by businesses, even US statistics show this, has to do with the fact that this is not a substitute. This is not a technology that replaces something that already exists. This is something that entails a new form of work, a new form of creating new services, etc. So this is not something that's going to replace something that already exists. And like, here's a typewriter now, here's your word processor computer. This is something quite different. How do you see US antitrust dealing with that?
That would be a different question. I mean, AI is a general purpose technology.
Exactly.
And so it should be treated like the internet or electricity or something like that. I would say that, I mean, the US is too constrained by its exposed system, very much court-based and whatnot. And unfortunately, I don't think it's easy to get out of that. And I think in that sense, Europe, generally speaking, has an advantage in the sense that it has greater flexibility. I think that both the DMA approach and the DMU approach are the right way of going about things, which is this enact regulation. I think one important difference is I think the DMU is closer to my ideal of regulation that's based on basic principles. I think the reason why, by the way, I'm not answering exactly your question, but I think I'm saying something that's interesting. I think the reason why there's this difference, and here I'm going to be a little provocative, is that European Union and continental Europe are still the victims of Napoleonic law and Roman law. And it's very hard to get rid of it. It gets attached to you. And so that means ex-ante regulation. You call it whatever you want, but you're still attached to the idea. If it's not in the code, it does not exist. And regulating something that we don't know, something we cannot forecast 3 months from now with a code, is destined to failure, in my opinion. And that's the reason why, as much as there's this cultural divide between the common law approach and the Napoleonic approach, I think for once, the European Union should sort of give in and understand that the common law approach is preferable. We cannot regulate what we don't know at this moment. At least we cannot regulate in detail what we don't know. I would be remiss if I did not mention that this has enormous dangers as well, and we have to be aware of that. One, of course, is legal uncertainty. I mean, if you have a constitution like the English Constitution, and it's not written, I mean, you need years and years, maybe centuries, in order to understand what that means. So one is legal uncertainty. The other one is capture. But I think these are two risks worth taking. I really think that one has to move away from ex-ante regulation in this kind of industries. Sorry, that was not exactly your question. And I think the US has that problem too, but for different reasons, because it's so attached to exposed regulation.
Some years ago, I was at a conference, and a professor from a business school here in Portugal was arguing about, it had to do with the regulation of some new forms, disruptive forms of transportation. And he was saying that one of the advantages of being these big techs is that you come in and you sort of break things, and that means that you can shape regulation. So this was a form of ex-ante capture of regulation. And so I think that also goes to the advice that you gave, that we have to be wary not to regulate in terms of a given business model, because then you're really preventing new innovation, further innovation. That's all we had time for. Many thanks to all of you for your excellent contributions, great points. Please join me in an applause to our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.